So we're doing entire debate, lasted 56 seconds, starting in 3, 2, 1.
This atheist and this pastor were debating morality, and the ending literally feels scripted because it's such an epic mic drop. Check it out.
Mic drop. I work with more murderers and pedophiles all the time.
I have a least favorite pedophile.
Are they wrong?
Are they wrong?
Yes.
They're wrong by your subjective standard.
They are technically intersubjectively wrong.
So they're not absolute.
Intersubjectively. No, because absolute would mean that it would be
So the
debate's over. Why?
They are intersubjectively wrong.
So you admit.
I would just say subjectively.
They are not absolutely wrong. The Green River Killer is not absolutely
But
wrong.
if it was absolute, then you wouldn't need to say it. You would need to enforce it. I don't think you know what the word absolute means.
You came to debate that your worldview provides a foundation for ethics.
Foundation for ethics, so you have to actively self-enforce.
The humanist perspective does provide a foundation for ethics because, again,
You have to actively uphold them.
Is wrong. Murder
Wrong by a subjective human standard.
according to the cultural conversation that we are all of which a part.
So the second that the
cultural conversation changes,
murder become moral?
Yes, because that's what's happened in the past. Suddenly they become moral because, again, they become protected by law, like slavery was protected by law. So all of a sudden, again, that society considered it moral to do that. Even, that would have had to have been the case. Otherwise, they wouldn't have done it. So that is all it takes is the collective conversation. So he's technically, objectively correct. I love this term of absolute. Like, define what you mean by absolute. Because to me, just maybe I'm a stickler for definitions, absolute would mean that it goes without saying that it's inherent, that it can't be questioned. So if it can't be questioned, how come so many people can question it? How come so many people can do those things despite that? We might collectively hold and say, okay, doing this thing is wrong, and we all agree, or the majority of people agree, but if it was absolute, you wouldn't need to do that. Again, an absolute would go without saying. It would be an inherent, where it's as absolute as the air that you have to breathe, right? You need oxygen to survive. You really aren't going to see debate on that, and nobody has to uphold it or enforce it. It's just, it goes without saying. So you can say that's an absolute. You need food to eat to survive, right? This is not an absolute because you can just easily disregard it. I can't disregard, I'm just going to stop breathing because I don't feel like it. I subjectively don't think I need to, right? But you could do that with the other side of, you could just disregard this supposedly absolute morality by saying, I'm going to ignore it and just do a crime anyway. So it's a really frustrating argument because people are acting like, look at him dunk on him, but it's always these unpleasant truths. Like, you're claiming something that is true that is uncomfortable to believe, so wow, you must be wrong. Imagine saying that. So it's called Entire Debate Lasted 56 Seconds. Let's listen to it. Or let me do the 3, 2, 1. Like, my false inherent morality isn't actually inherent. Wow, your argument is so wrong. Also, we need the law and constant social indoctrination to uphold this artificial morality that we subjectively construct. Like, what do you mean, dude? Because they're saying like, it's like society determines what is moral and immoral, and they're saying it as an absolute, like, so if society says slavery is okay and it's moral, then it becomes moral. But it does by their standard because they're doing it. Like, slavery did happen, so evidently it is just as subjective. You might not like it, you might not agree with it, and so the way that you conquer that isn't to say, morality is absolute. That's why all these immoral things by that absolute standard of morality still happen and have happened throughout all of human history because it's so absolute that it requires constant human effort to uphold it, which means it's not absolute. That means it is subjective. That means it requires constant reinforcement and practice through externality, enforcement, laws, social indoctrination, stigma, etc. So, in other words, you're admitting it's subjective in practice. So how would you have beaten slavery? You would have had to socially come up with that notion and collectively agree as a society that this is wrong and we shouldn't do it, which is kind of eventually what did happen, right? A lot of people were against it. They have a war, kind of partly about it at least. Like, so this notion, morality isn't inherent and it's up to what society says it is at a given time, but that is true because that's what they practice. So your belief in an absolute morality doesn't stop the reality of subjective morality happening, that terrible things happen all the time. And so, again, you're confusing the ideal with the reality. Just because your ideal is, yes, I would love a world where nobody ever hurts anybody or nobody ever kills anybody. That might be my moral and my subjective ideal. and many people may agree with that. However, if it was absolute, then it wouldn't be a concern. It's not absolute because it takes that constant upholding of it. So you have to win that argument and fight through social Darwinism, because if a society really does believe in something that is, they wouldn't do it if they didn't think it was right. So how did we get to the point where they thought slavery was right, or genocide was right, or things like this, or how did they let it happen anyway? So I love this is one of the dumbest things I've ever seen, because you're not saying that you're treating it as an absolute, but realizing it's not one at the same time. So you just don't get it. Like, you'll say morality is absolute, but it requires constant human action to practice it and uphold it. But then you're also saying that, well, if it's subjective, that means anything can be subjectively moral. But it is from their point of view, right? So you're saying, how could it be subjectively moral to have slaves and to do all these terrible things? Well, it could be because people have done it, and they often don't believe that they're doing anything wrong when they're doing it. Otherwise, that's very hard to justify. If they realize they're doing something wrong, especially collectively as a society, they probably wouldn't do it so widely and so conspicuously. So you're acknowledging, like, oh, so all it would take for society to believe that slavery is moral is for them to just assert it or to practice it. Well, evidently that did happen. There was slavery in various societies throughout history. So yes, all it took was for people to collectively believe that. But that shows you how arbitrary and subjective morality is, and human standards are. That they do change at the drop of a hat, and that's how simple and how easily manipulated they can be. So you have to stay vigilant and hold it to a high standard, and don't take morality for granted and take power away from people, and realize that you have to actively uphold something if you do believe it. Let me try to get it with the timestamp, but it's not really working for me too well here. It's only 56 seconds long. But yeah, that's true. A real slam dunk. I'm glad I never have to worry about anything immoral by your subjective standard happening, because I guess it's just absolute. So the fact that you have to actively uphold it, like, what if the police all change their mind and they don't want to enforce the law anymore? Suddenly it's not moral anymore. I mean, again, you can hold your own standard, but it's not, again, absolute would imply, like, an absolute is the fact that you need oxygen to breathe, to survive, right? That's an absolute. It doesn't matter what your subjective opinion is, you still need it, unless you use some major technological workaround. But with morality, it's like, oh, it's wrong to kill somebody, but people still do it. So you can still say it's wrong. That's certainly your opinion. Most people would agree with you. I would agree with you, but it doesn't mean that it's absolute. It means it's preferential. We want to believe it. We want to agree with it. But yeah, it doesn't mean it's absolute. So this is one of those things that's like insidious and tempting, that it's easy, like, oh, he's even saying, oh, it's a mic drop and this and that. It's easy to get lulled into these sorts of things that seem like, oh, look, it's a short form, quick edit, hot take. But if you actually think about it at all, to me, the word absolute means that it's unquestionable. To me, it means that it's inherent. So unless, again, I don't know what definition of absolute you could be using here, but if you say that it's absolute, what that means is now it doesn't require subjective human reinforcement. It doesn't require subjective human law enforcement or anything, right? It would be absolute. So in the context of God, you would say, well, he would strike you down with a bolt of lightning if you did something wrong, right? It's wrong, so therefore God will punish you. But instead, oh no, subjective human beings have to punish you with law enforcement, with court, with, again, even social stigma. You have to be indoctrinated from a young age. If you were born in the jungle, right, you wouldn't have these same views necessarily. So you can argue for an end result. And let me watch it again. This is really incredible that, okay, we're starting in, let me see. We're starting in 3, 2, 1. This atheist and this pastor were debating morality. Ending literally feels scripted because it's such an epic mic drop. Let's check it out. I work with murderers and pedophiles all the time.
Are they wrong?
He's very annoying. Yes, they are.
They're wrong by our subjective view.
Intersubjectively
wrong.
No.
Thank you. So the debate's over, friends.
If it was absolute, then you wouldn't need to say it. So he's acting like it's his position.
Mr. Anderson, that they are not absolutely wrong. The Green River Killer is not absolutely wrong. Ted Bundy is not absolutely wrong.
It's so absolute that you have to have this conversation about it and feel self-righteous about it.
Worldview provides a foundation for ethics.
A foundation for ethics that you have to actively self-enforce and uphold.
A foundation for ethics, because again, rape is wrong, murder is wrong. According to the culture,
According to the laws, according to society.
The second that the cultural conversation changes, then rape and murder become moral?
See, that also shows like no faith in social Darwinism too. Like, oh, those things suddenly become moral because society says they are, but then wouldn't you assume that that wouldn't happen or that shouldn't happen? But even when you look back at history, certain things we would consider immoral today were considered okay back in the past, and even, moral, or at least morally acceptable, not, impermissible. So how can you say that's not true? So when you're saying that, it's like, okay, intersubjectively wrong, but let's just say subjectively, the point being that if it wasn't subjective, this conversation wouldn't even serve a purpose, right? So what do you mean by the word absolute? It's so absolute that I have to subjectively argue it with you, and you can disagree subjectively, and you can practice something else subjectively, like if you choose to just ignore it 5 seconds later. Like, here's an absolute. You have to breathe. You need oxygen. And even if you subjectively believe something different 5 seconds later, you still have to breathe, otherwise you'll die. Whereas with this, you could say, oh, it's wrong to kill somebody, and that's absolute. But then 5 seconds later, you believe something different, and you can practice something different just like that. So again, it's not being framed as, oh, you want to do that or you should do that. It's a question that if that's all it takes, then evidently it's not absolute. And that's why we put so much effort into, again, indoctrination and reinforcement and law enforcement, all these things that are subjective and require human input and interaction to be possible. Right, otherwise there would be no, then people could just do whatever they want, and it's a very strange thing. Let me watch it again. It's like saying what people want to hear versus because the word absolute doesn't mean a whole lot then. Because the worldview of ethics would require that you have they are not absolute. Because you have to actively hold it up yourself, otherwise because if suddenly the conversation changes and you change the law, then suddenly that would be right. So you would have, if it's no longer against the law and you change that, which you would think wouldn't happen, but that is how it works. It's as subjective as something being against the law. So, for example, gay marriage might have been against the law until now, and then the conversation changed to enable it, to make it legal, and so now suddenly something that was considered wrong before by society, enforced by its laws, is now considered okay. So that's all it took, is that subjective conversation and change to occur. And then let me look at the one from Jesse. But yeah, that's a perfect example of telling people what they want to hear versus what is actually true, like a inherent versus contrivance response argument. One person is arguing for the ideal. We want this to be absolute. We want to believe it, right? That is good to think of. But by saying it's absolute means that, okay, then I guess we don't need to do anything. It's pointless to even debate it, because if it's so absolute, then none of our subjective views or actions would have any impact. It would just be as absolute as the sun in the sky, or as our need to eat food, or as our need to breathe. So it would just go without saying. It wouldn't require subjective human input. But then also, it's a case where, it's absolute, but it's subject to all that, and then why would people still be able to do that? So, you're telling people, again, inherent versus contrivance response. You realize the inherent is, no, it's not absolute. It's subjective. People can just arbitrarily do whatever they want. Right? That's just a fact. It doesn't mean they should. But then you have to counteract that, which we actively do, again, with laws, with indoctrination, with, teaching our kids morality, with social stigma reinforcement. So through all those means, we actively uphold the illusion of this absolute. But if it was absolute, you wouldn't need to do those things. So it's not useful to pretend it's absolute. It's more useful to say, no, it is subjective, and so that's why we have to be vigilant and uphold it and try to kind of enforce and reinforce our views and try to uphold them in society, because if we don't, then people will just do whatever they want. So let me look at one thing here. Okay, so here I had an urge to react to a video that I saw, and so I can't even really read the name of it in the position that I'm in, but I'll try to catch a peek of it. It is Cliff something. He's basically discussing you'll know what it is when I start talking about it. I hate this with the orientation of shorts, that it always plays shorts vertically, so I'd have to change my whole phone stand position for what I'm doing. It's, his last name starts with a C, reveals dark truth about atheists. And again, atheist itself is a non-label and an invalid term. There's no such thing as an atheist, or we're all born atheists. It's not an outward position. So you don't define somebody by what they don't do, you define somebody by what they do. So if you're religious and you can specify the religion, that's fine. Right, and I'm not saying there's even anything wrong with that, but it's an outward position to be religious. It's not an outward position to simply, you're born and you don't automatically believe in God or believe in something. You have to actively be indoctrinated into the church or the specifics and the particulars of it. That's one of my main objections to religion. I've said it can be positive psychologically, it can give people structure, etc. So I'm not even somebody who would be against it, but I don't like the real intellectual dishonesty with it, which this guy even says here. I did see this clip earlier, but it's a case where the problem is, again, you compare it to folly favoritism, or at least I've done this, where how could you say you don't believe in religion because it's not real or true or logical, but then you indulge in entertainment and escapism? That's not real either. And yet you take a certain amount of time on it and you let it have a certain amount of impact in your life, right? Why would you spend your time on something that you know isn't real? The comparison is good, but the difference is actually pretty telling. With fiction or folly favoritism, you acknowledge it isn't real, so you're doing it for psychological reasons and you enjoy it, etc. With religion, you are pretending it's real, and even so real that it dictates your life or standards that are above, ordinary human conjecture. So basically, you're not acknowledging it's not real. That's the difference. So folly favoritism, it's not real, so you're only doing it for escapism or entertainment or enrichment of creative, inspiration and stuff. That's fine, because, well, it's still a flawed process, but at least you're acknowledging, okay, I know it's not real, but I'm just indulging it. Whereas with religion, you're not doing that. You're saying it's real, you're saying it's absolute, etc. So let's look at this guy's argument. It's one of those things that I'm just disappointed in when I hear it. And there's a lot of likes on the video. There's a lot of comments agreeing with what he's saying. There's actually a warning because he talks about suicide. So YouTube gives you a warning about it. But look, dude, it's a very... Let's just address it. I mean, I've dealt with this kind of argument before. It's an idyllic desire cui bono argument, right? That's the anti-fallacy here, is my cui bono effect that I talk about. Not really my term, but the effect and way I use it. who benefits from what he's saying, or what argument is actually being made? Does he make any sort of logical, specific, substantive argument to justify a particular religion or even religions in general? Because what I always point to is, how can you say yours is right and everyone else's is wrong? You could say, oh, well, that actually validates the fact that so many different cultures throughout history have all been religious. What are the chances of that? But it seems like a positive, but it actually hurts the argument, because that just shows you people have a psychological need, and so the specifics are arbitrary. Greek gods we treat as mythology today, or other, countless gods in different religions throughout history. We dismiss all of those, but oh no, we're going to believe in Christianity now. That's the right one. This time we got it right, and every other one is wrong. See, that's not even my position. Like, oh, you're just subjectively a non-believer, or the only way I guess an atheist, supposed atheist, like you'd use that as a label, would be if you were anti-religion, like, oh, you're against it and you're actively arguing, but it's not even agnostic. You don't have to qualify it. Like, I don't have to explain the secrets of the universe as a mere lowly animal who has slightly greater self-awareness than other animals. That's what a human being is. Like, we're way too narcissistic and egotistical to think that we should have all the answers to the universe from day one. It's the unwillingness to be puzzled, absurdist fallacy. Like, no, we don't have all the answers to the universe. We don't know everything. Even with thousands of years of technological advancements in science, we still don't have all the answers to the universe. Right? That's the more mature, logical thing to say, instead of, oh no, we have all the answers. The universe is made in our image, the world, and God made us in his image, and everything revolves around us, and when an animal kills an animal, it's okay, but when we do it, it's the end of the world, like, according to these idyllic, higher standards, not just that enforceable by human subjective structures, like, law enforcement, etc. Like, we get why we have that. Right, again, it's not a functional argument, so people always try to hide behind that with some sort of straw man fallacy, like, well, if you say killing a person isn't absolutely wrong and there is no God, then how can you have morality? Well, I could tell you how, like the golden rule, like, I don't want to be killed, so I'm not going to kill other people. How about that? Or just common respect for other people. Why can't you have that? Like, and people fear that subjective basis, though, because then, oh, it's your word against mine. So if somebody feels like, oh, well, I'm not killing people out of respect, or I'm not committing crimes out of respect, but somebody else could just as easily say, well, I feel like doing it anyway. But they do that despite the law and despite your supposed God anyway. But it's like the subjective versus the absolute versus the subjective. Like, you're trying to put a standard that's above that. Like, somebody might subjectively say killing someone is wrong, or maybe they'd say killing somebody is right, or it's okay. But the difference is that's one word against another. So even if you have 99.9% of people say this thing is wrong, all it takes is that 0.01% to say, oh no, it's right, and then they can just, it's your word against theirs. So no matter how much collective agreement you have, it's still subjective versus subjective. It's just one subjective person versus another, instead of, oh no, it's God saying it, it's not me saying it, it's God saying it. So you kind of bypass that critical faculty and say, so now it makes it absolute, instead of, oh no, it's just a subjective standard that we have to subjectively enforce. And so, yeah, being an atheist is not our position. You don't even have to qualify it agnostic. Why can't you just not know, but veer on the side? Like, I would say, I would be relatively neutral, but what actually pushes me in the other way is all the specifics and particulars of it. Like, again, how can every religion be wrong and yours be right? How can there be so many different little nuances? Like, oh, there happens to be an elephant god in India. Oh, what are the chances? Because there are elephants around them, so they're taking in what's in their environment, right? Show me something from religion that isn't man-made, like, in terms of scripture and stuff. It's all a reflection of their immediate environment around them, or certain standards and morality that people would want to have in society anyway, like laws and crimes are reinforced there and stigmatized, or something else, like, it's just all idyllic at a distance, like non-accountable, false absolute. So, again, I'm not even denying that some hypothetical possibility, but the more you hear about people's framing of it, it feels arbitrary. I don't need to justify, like, oh, something isn't the case. you would need to justify it, and all the justifications come from a place of desire and psychological need that, again, can be positive and give people structure, but that doesn't make it true. That's the only point. It doesn't make it true. It doesn't make it absolute. It could make it useful, so I'm not even denying that. Although I would argue that just as much as it can be useful, it can also be damaging. So I would never be the person to say, oh, billions of people have been killed throughout history, and even to this day, various times, in the name of religion, because I'm not going to blame it on that. Like, if religion didn't exist, people would still kill other people as they have throughout history. And, you know what I mean? Like, I'm not going to do that, even though that would be a cop-out sort of argument. I can't talk for some reason. My voice is completely fucked up. The point is that, I'm not going to act like that, oh, all these people were killed in the name of religion, because it's still just ultimately a pretense. How people use it is different than, so I'm not going to say that. But I'm also not going to completely say, well, it gives people structure and peace of mind, so therefore that makes it true, right? You can make a functional argument that, oh, we can believe something that we know isn't true because it's useful and enjoyable, or, it gives us peace of mind and stuff like that. Fine. You want to make a functional argument, I can accept that at times. Although, again, you get lost in the details and the specifics. My logical razor don't specify the conflict comes into play. Like, generally, okay, if it gives you structured peace of mind, some of these, moral standards and stuff to follow. But you get caught up on all the little particulars, like, oh, this arbitrary tradition here, you can't eat meat on this day, you can't eat fish on that day, whatever you want to get caught up in. That's where it becomes arbitrary. Like, what does that really have to do with anything? And even you see people try to adjust it and say, oh, when the Bible says that being gay is wrong, oh no, it doesn't actually mean that, and Christians now accept that, that somewhat, depending, and they try to do revisionist history and say there's a lot of bigoted things potentially in the Bible, which, again, I'm not passing judgment on that. I'm just saying if you want to believe it, then believe it all the way, and if you don't, then don't. But instead, oh no, we'll change it to suit the modern machination process of the time that we happen to live in. Did Jesus say to sit on your phone for 5 hours a day? Did Jesus say to drive a car? Did Jesus say to, engage in all this machination process, pollution and all this ravaging of resources around the planet? Did Jesus say something about using Facebook and Twitter, or like fucking, what is all this? This is like machination process that wasn't there at the time, and you might think, oh, those things are just arbitrary and specific, but actually that's not true, because there were a lot of specific references at the time that were made based on the technology that was available then. So the problem with belief is, again, it comes from a place of desire. So what can be difficult with that is there's really not much of an argument to even be had. Again, you cannot dissuade with reason what came about by desire, one of my logical razors in my debate format. The ultimate point is the fact that let me think here. You have the ability to consider that you cannot dissuade with the reason what came about by desire. So it's like two separate arguments that you're having, and again, you get lost on the specifics and the particulars of it. It can be used for both good and bad purposes. It can give people structure, everything like that. This is really annoying to do. Hang on. When I decide not to put my mic on, I'll just fix it right now. Okay, I hooked up the mic so it makes it a little easier. I don't know why I do that. I go into it not expecting that I'm going to do a session when I'm driving, and then I feel like doing it in the middle. But no, let's look at this again. I've shredded the same sort of argument with the cui bono effect. Like, your argument is basically, it's comforting and peace of mind, and it's also appealing to the human ego and narcissism. So how could you not believe it? You go to heaven and all these wonderful things happen, and the people you don't like go to hell, and it gives you so much peace of mind. Like, so in other words, people have a strong psychological need and desire to believe it, so therefore you should believe it. On a functional level, maybe that could be made, but that does not make it accurate or true. In fact, you're sidestepping the whole issue. You're saying, look at all these positive benefits or desirable aspects of believing in it. Like, oh, I want to believe in Santa Claus and the Tooth Fairy. Just because you want to believe something doesn't make it true. In fact, it hurts the argument, and that's where the cui bono effect comes in. Like, look at the incentive behind it. Right? If you want to believe, okay, good. But it's not enough. You have to outwardly insist. You have to make a big thing out of it. You have to make a big spectacle. There's a quote like that. A man says to the universe, "Sir, I exist." And then the universe responds. The universe doesn't respond. That's the better point. Like, we don't care about your narcissistic ego. You're just an animal that's slightly greater self-awareness. Rather than be grateful for that, you instead, have this cognitive dissonance and contrivance. I'll explain this as we go through, but it bothers me because, again, you don't need to label atheists. We're all born atheists. You don't need to justify what you don't do. Again, you don't say like, oh, this person's a walker because he's not driving a car. This guy's a driver because he doesn't walk. Like, you don't say what somebody doesn't do of all the things in existence they could potentially do, right? You don't say, oh, he's not a Christian. He's not a... No. You say, if you are something outwardly, yes. There's nothing outward about being an atheist. You're just living. You're just alive, like an animal. Is an animal an atheist? Do insects and other creatures have religion? So it shows you quite clearly what the blueprint is. That yes, if you could maybe point to some more intelligent animals, right, starting to do stuff like that, where as an animal becomes more intelligent, it would start to have ritualistic tendencies and faith and belief. So in other words, it's not a product of reality, it's a product of your psychological need that, again, in an uncertain, unknown world, you have the unwillingness to be puzzled, you want some answers, you want some false certainty, you want some peace of mind, you want some comfort about all the unknown subjective, contemplation of the mind and secrets of the universe. You want some answers to that. So the solution is to just pretend or to, again, seek meaning in your environment. Like, oh, it's storming, it's raining, and you can't explain the weather. So now that's the whole irony. People say in the modern day religion is dying out and people are becoming, sacrosanct to religion. Couldn't it just be that science is becoming more advanced and we have a lot more answers? Again, not all the answers in the universe, but that we have more answers than we had in the past. So instead of relying on, falling back on superstition, like, oh, it's if you offer something to the gods, they'll give us rain for our crops. Instead, now we can explain how the rain works, and to some extent we might even be able to control it, as we go forward. So, like, with our technology, we can control the weather. And there's a lot of conspiracies to do with that, but clearly it's something we could do. So now you're putting power back in human hands and saying, well, we understand how it works, so we don't need to be superstitious and ritualistic about it, because that's all those things do. Even if you're right, you're wrong in that sense. Like, oh, we're going to defer and cede power to God. But God is so powerful that, assuming, is even real, etc., that it wouldn't matter. So in other words, you caring about God or thinking about God or deferring to God is irrelevant. God has given you the ability and power to do what you can do. So pretend God doesn't exist and do the maximum that you can with the ability that you have. Don't worry about, oh, I'm going to just let things go where they will and God will guide me. No. God has given you the potential that you have that you'll never meet because you're in this half-mass reductive state. But this is what religion does, or faith in general. It takes power away from people. Don't reach your maximum full potential in this finite zero-sum existence because, oh, we have promises of heaven and all this. Like, the point being that, oh, God, it's just so dumb. Like, okay, so atheism is not a position, right? You don't need to justify not doing something. They need to justify doing it. And in those very specific, particular ways. And again, it shows you the psychological need, the ritualistic tendencies, the desirability or even functionality if it does not create a factual foundation or basis. So it's one of those, again, closed structure contrivances where why do you believe it or why is it so? Just because you want it to be. And you just insist upon it, and part of it is even to not hold yourself accountable, right? Oh, it's heretical to... Man, I really cannot talk today. I don't know what it is. It is heretical to question it as if, no, God has given you the ability to question it with your mind, but then, oh no, we aren't allowed to not that it holds up to any questions very well, that you would be able to hold it accountable as much as you want. And then the other point is the fact that you have, but that's one of the biggest claims I could make, is that, religion takes power away from people, because you're saying, I'm going to defer to God, I'm going to pray to God, you're going to hope that God does something. But if God could be influenced by your subjective hopes, then it wouldn't be God at all, because then he would just be at the mercy of your whims, right? And you could just control him completely, and then, that wouldn't make sense, and other people would be doing the same thing. So God doesn't care about your little whims and your personal self-interest, despite your narcissism that you think the universe revolves around you. But it's ironic, too. The basis of religion is narcissistic, that we think, we are created in God's image and this and that, and all these standards, revolve around our interests and intentions. But then it also reduces you to a supposedly humbled state where, I'm going to be reduced to this lesser state than my full potential and self-actualization would do. And so now, I don't know. It strips away your potential. It makes you defer to invisible authority. It makes you reduce to a half-mast state, never reach your full potential, never fully self-actualize, self-awareness, full objective. Again, all these things that even if you were religious, you would say, well, God created you with the capacity to do all this, and you're undermining it in the name of God. All these things that God supposedly wouldn't have wanted you to do, but created you with the ability to do, and you have to resist it. You have to prove something to God. Why would... Again, we're dealing in absolutes here, that, God, this all-powerful, all-knowing, all-seeing being, would not want you to kill another person. God doesn't want you to kill. But God is so weak in that will of stopping you from killing that it would come down to your subjective desire. If you feel like doing it, you can just do it, right? And then it comes down to subjective human enforcement and indoctrination, you punish them and you try to stigmatize, why? So in other words, God is just sick, by how we would define it. He wants to see people suffer and struggle, even though he could have just prevented us from doing that in the first place. Create us with the inability to kill, either physically or mentally. We just somehow we won't do it. If he didn't want us to do it, just don't do it, right? We would not have the capacity to even do it. So, or for example, faith. If there was a God, then evidently they don't want us to believe in him, because they give us the option not to, right? So it's like the emperor has no clothes fallacy, if you don't believe, you just don't get it. But if God was so powerful and God wanted people to believe in him, then we would have no choice, or it would be so, foregone conclusion. But instead, no, you have to kind of, dance around it and do mental gymnastics. And it's on one hand, a lot of these arguments would point to either God's not all-powerful, in which case then a lot of this is moot, there's a lot of flaws and incapabilities, or God is all-powerful, but then don't even worry about it, because God's going to do what God's going to do. You can't influence it, you can't impact it. Worrying about it, thinking about it, caring about it, praying about it, none of that is going to matter, right? God has God's plan, and just don't even give it a second thought and focus fully on your potential and the impact that you can have. Don't focus on things you can't control, right? God's will, supposedly. So again, God is outside your control. The weather is outside your control. Well, I was just saying how it might not be entirely, but you know what I mean? Don't even worry about it then. Maximize your ability, your potential that you have, and human potential and ability, and then whatever God's going to do, God's going to do. And if you could impact it subjectively, it's a moot point. What else do I have to say? The fallacy, our premise dictates that everything must be created in our human logic, but then by that logic, God too must be created, right? So if the question is what created the universe, and your answer is God, then God too must be created. And if God can be exempt from that need to be created, then why can't the universe be? So either way, you're posing an absolute and a premise and then making an exception to it. So it's your own internal claim, right? I could just say, okay, maybe everything doesn't need to be created, and I can't explain that because, again, I don't have all the answers of the universe. But you see how the false certainty, false absolute is favored by a mindless mass of sheep, I guess you could say, that if you say with certainty, yeah, people would cling to the certainty even if it's completely nonsense, right? Just make something up rather than just say, maybe we don't know. Maybe we we aren't all-knowing, right? We're not gods ourselves. So how would we have known this thousands of years ago with even a lesser state of technology, right, than what we have now? But again, it's a psychological need, and it is a case where, oh yeah, this is one of my quotes as well. I guess I'm going through a lot of things to do with religion, but they often fall on deaf ears when I've had these conversations. Like, people just want to believe, so they'll believe, but that's fine. That's where that one quote comes in so key. That's my biggest logical razor on religion. You cannot dissuade with reason what came about by desire. So in other words, it doesn't matter. You're trying to discuss it logically and rationally in terms of facts and details or whatever. It doesn't matter, because the reason why they believe it isn't because of facts and logic and reason. So you can't poke a hole in that, because that's not why they believe it. They believe it because they want to. That's all. Not everyone, but there might be youth indoctrination. I said that might be why, but I'm just saying, like, mainly people believe it because they want to, because it gives them peace of mind, comfort, etc. That's why. So because they believe it because they want to, you would have to appeal to that desire, like, okay, I'll give you something else to believe in that's even more desirable, or remove the need, absolutist tendency. But instead, you get this thing like, you're not, again, you cannot dissuade with reason what came about by desire. That's one of my favorite logical razors that I've ever come up with from my debate format. It's very on point. It's what I do when I just feel helpless in an argument, not because I can't win the argument, but it's just like, you realize the nature of the argument, right? It's not me logically arguing against somebody else logically. It's me arguing against, well, I want there to be a heaven, and it gives me comfort. So that effectively is what they're saying. So you can't win that. But no, this is another one, and then I'll get into watching this. It's just a short, but certainly got me in the mood. This is called, this concept I talk about is sort of the blame and the thinking. I can't remember what exactly I called it, but when something bad happens, right? Let's use any example, like a natural disaster or some horrible event, right? Something bad happens, and again, the absolutist harsh perspective, without all these kind of things, would be like, well, it's your fault for living in a flood zone. It's your fault for, it might sound harsh, your lead is victim blamer, but there's a deeper meaning to it. It's placing full emphasis on your potential, human potential ability. So it's putting humans not on a pedestal, but in the forefront. Like, well, you knew that area could flood, so why did you live there, right? You could have lived anywhere else, potentially find a way, so you're putting yourself in a situation where you're aware, or you could be aware of all the positives and negatives. So then when the negative happens, you should be like, well, I should have expected that. I should have been better prepared for that. I should have found an alternative. So it's your measure, your choice, your process, and then you suffer the consequences of it. So that would be the onus that the absolutist puts. And again, it's holding human beings in high regard, that we are much more capable and intelligent than what we are reduced to structure and practice, killing our potential, basically. But no, you don't blame God when something bad happens, like, again, the disaster or some horrible event. But then you thank God when it ends. Like, oh, thank God for saving me from this horrible event. But you don't blame God and say, well, what about blaming him for putting you in that situation in the first place, or allowing it to happen? So you'd say, oh, thank God for ending the flood, but you don't say, curse God for flooding my area that I live in and my house and everything. Like, so what you're using is it's a non-accountable closed structure standard that it can never be wrong. So when something good happens, it's thanks to God. When something bad happens, it's not God's fault. Or it's okay, it's part of God's mysterious design. So even by your own subjective standard, it's not consistent at all. So what you get into is, like, luck is the same thing. You think everything revolves around you. So what you have is the ability to consider this okay, you have the ability to consider that either God is not that powerful then, so God can't prevent bad things from happening, but God can help end the bad thing, so he only deserves selective credit and not blame. So you're saying he's not really all-powerful, or or that God just doesn't care or have your interest in mind. So it's like God wants to see you suffer or allows you to suffer and then intervenes at some random undescribed point and then saves you from that suffering that they put you in the first place. So that would show you why God's not on your side, or God is objective and doesn't take sides. So in that case, then why does any of that matter? Why would you thank God for taking you out of that situation and not blame him for putting you in that situation? Again, it's the same criteria. I'm not even making a claim. I'm just supposing, okay, God is all-powerful, so bad things happening would also be within their control. So they're making bad things happen only to end the bad thing from happening, and then you're grateful that it ended, but you're not holding that against it, that it started and that it happened in the first place, basically. Okay, let's look at this. Cliff something, his last name starts with a K. I can't read because it's at a wrong angle, but it doesn't matter. Reveals like a dark truth about atheists. It's the one that's sort of censored by YouTube because you have to confirm it deals with sensitive topics like suicide, that he does say that in there. So, okay, we're starting. I don't even have to do the timestamp, but I'll just keep pausing it. So let's see what he says. I mean, just think about the results of living a life without God. It's meaningless. Okay, so we start here with the cui bono effect already. Right, I'll keep pausing it because whatever. It's a short video anyway. So you're saying it's meaningless. So there's two problems with this, right? The first is the human ego, right? That, again, all we are is self-aware animals with slightly greater intelligence than other animals. So now we think the world revolves around us. There needs to be some special meaning, right? It has to somehow cater to us. We have to have some other element that we find in it. Like, what is an animal's meaning of life? They live because they're alive. So you can say it's a result of a random process in nature and they can't explain it. But they live, they try to live, that could be the meaning from a naturalistic perspective. Just live as long as you can, or live, enjoy what you can. Eat the sweet nectars of nature and just, soak it all in and just live as long as you can. Experience different things that the world has to offer, and that could be it. Why does it have to be any special meaning? It's a zero-sum process, right? Like, that's just a narcissism that human beings have, that they think everything revolves around them and they're so special and everything like this, right? Heavy ego involved. Why does there have to be special meaning? Is there special meaning for an insect? Is there special meaning for for a dog, for an animal, other animals? So the fact that we even look for that special meaning is itself the problem. And it's also a byproduct of contrivance. We have to try to find meaning when we're reduced to a lesser state than our inherent natural state, again, through contrivance. So we can't do this, we can't do that, we're inhibited in this way, we have to adhere to contrivance that way. So because we're reduced to this unnatural contrivance state, now that goes against our inherent tendencies, now we have to contrive some meaning potentially, right? Some of the desire for it comes from that. We have to contrive it because now we're restricted, so we have to overcompensate and try to cope with that. Whereas if you lived an inherent natural lifestyle, now you wouldn't have those questions or cognitive dissonance, because what you see is what you get. Nature is nature. Go pick the berries, go enjoy, whatever it is that's out there. And just like, what you have is the ability to consider that, again, this desire for meaning or expectation of it is a very egocentric, human-centric, self-obsessed, narcissistic point of view that people have. That, again, what meaning do animals have? They're alive because they were born and they exist and they try to live and they try to survive. This doesn't need to be any more meaning for them than that, but for us, there is. So, and again, even if you were correct, now that's the first problem, is, again, to even seek meaning is narcissistic, right? And what you point to with that. But number two is, even if you were right and saying, oh, well, that means it's a meaningless existence, that doesn't explain adequately why religion is valid. That gives you the cui bono, like why you would want to believe it. Like, okay, so now you're pointing out the psychological need or desire that people have that's not rooted in truth or logic or reason. You're saying that people have an incentive and a bias and a desire to believe something to try to give them structure and meaning where they otherwise might feel that it's lacking. And I've also laid out the contrivance response structure. Like, you're not simply born in your inherent state and just doing what you're naturally doing like an animal would even do. Just the world is your oyster, just uninhibited, right, in your natural state. since you're so heavily indoctrinated and you have to constantly contrive, respond against the inherent nature of your being, like everything you might naturally do, you have to contrive and respond against it, and you're not at peace with your own inherent nature and tendencies, and you even deny them, and you pose a false inherent contrivance response state, and so now you create this artificial contrivance structure that may be functional, may have its benefits, may overextend, but because you do that, now you created an unnatural state, so now perhaps you're seeking meaning or some other reinforcement, and the reason why you're doing that is because of the simple fact that you are the reason why you're doing that is because you're doing it because of the simple fact that sorry, when it gets bad driving, suddenly I get distracted like that. There's that blinking light again, some fucking barn. He had fixed it for a while there. Look, what I'm saying is that you have a contrivance state where I like when people overtake me, like, just fucking do it then, like, I don't care. Yeah, like the contrivance state. So, like, you have all these inherent tendencies in nature, and you're neither at peace with them nor acknowledge it, nor you know, you actively contrive against it, which, again, you might think that's useful and functional. I'm not even debating that. I'm saying because you do that, again, it creates an unnatural state, so now you have to justify your half-mass existence. That how can I justify, oh, it's the right thing to do because God says so, to sacrifice my own inherent desires, you know, instead of just hedonism, I'm going to have orgies and I'm just going to pick berries freely and the whole world is my oyster and take whatever I want and just, you know, do whatever I want, instead of being able to do that inherent state of being that would have at least less cognitive dissonance associated with it. No, now you're reduced to a half-mass state where you're heavily inhibited in every major way, right? If your base inherent tendencies, inherent desire, suggested, etc. Now, because of that, whether you would be a hedonist or whatever you want to call it, because you're so heavily inhibited, now you have to justify that somehow and say, well, it's okay to sacrifice so much because we're peasants working for heaven, is the expression that I said. Sacrifice in this lifetime the finite zero-sum existence that you have in front of you. And if you sacrifice that, then you're able to sacrifice the thing that you know for sure, that you're alive, you're here, your finite zero-sum existence is in front of you. Sacrifice that for promises of some heaven, some eternal life that you can't guarantee and you're not sure of. So that's, again, a great way to control people and reduce them to the structure, where you have you reduce them to structure because, at least if I get in a crash, you'll get my live audio reaction, because this is fucking... Look, dude. It's really the way that other people drive, too, is the problem. Like... Right, like, I would never have a problem, but other people create the problem. Like, fucking do whatever you want, overtake me if you want. My point was that you would have this ability to again, you're reduced to a half-mass state, so you have to justify it somehow, and again, part of that justification would be inhibit and diminish this life, this finite zero-sum life that you're sure of that's in front of you, for promises of heaven. that you can't verify and you're not sure about and everything like that. And so you're reducing this state that you're sure about for some promise of eternal life or heaven or etc. So it's a great way to control people again, because people won't be content with being reduced to a half-mast state and being inhibited heavily and controlled. But, oh no, you're doing it for that reason. So you can convince peasants to work for the promise of heaven. That, oh, if you're a good little peasant and you inhibit yourself in every way in your life, you'll get gratification and social contrivance will reward you and all that, which that's kind of a partly separate process, but it's the same similar concept, like that you will also be rewarded, you'll go to heaven for that. So it's a great way to control people. I almost don't even want to do this now, but it's not like there's much of a video. So again, the fact that it's meaningless, though, getting back to that point, on one hand, it's a narcissistic, egocentric, human-centric perspective that you think everything has to have meaning anyway, right, beyond just it's a zero-sum process, you just exist, you're just born, you're just like an animal, slightly greater self-awareness, right? It's not that everything is you're made in God's image and everything revolves around you and you have all the answers and, you have a grand scheme and grand meaning. It could just be a zero-sum process, just like animals, just like we see in nature. That could just be the reality of it. So your desire for the special meaning is itself telling that, again, it's an egocentric perspective. And then the second point is, even if you're right in saying that, okay, it's meaningless, and that's a negative, then, and assuming you're right in seeking that meaning, etc., the problem with that is the simple fact that or you should never go on like local roads or side roads when it's bad, because they don't get plowed or any shit. Like, they don't give a fuck. That's the funniest thing. Like, it could be the worst storm ever, but if you drive on like a highway, throughway, like a main road, it'll be just fine. It'll actually be great, right? Because they address that immediately and prioritize that. But if you drive, even if it's not too bad, you drive on some shitty back road, local road in the countryside, it'll be horrible because they don't give a shit about that. Like, that's the problem. But no, my point is that, again, even if the meaningless premise is correct, what is the real point of that argument? Believe in this fantasy that gives you a sense of purpose and peace of mind. Otherwise, oh my goodness, your life is meaningless. In other words, you're kind of like bribing people. You're saying, well, you have an incentive. It would be so depressing and sad and meaningless if you didn't believe this fantasy that's so comforting, so go ahead and believe it. Like, that doesn't validate that it's true or real or anything. It just says that all you're saying is that basically you have a desire to believe it. Like, again, the cui bono effect, I hate saying it so many times, but it just means, like, who benefits? Like, you're posing the benefit right there. You're saying people have a strong incentive, a strong bias, a strong desire, a strong preconceived notion to believe this because, the reason why you're believing it isn't because it's true then. It's because you have this egocentric, narcissistic, human-centered desire to believe, to have some false absolute sense of structure, meaning, and so therefore you get to do this. And the reason why you get to do it is because that's what you're saying. So if you don't believe, it would be meaningless. That's why you should believe, not because it actually, again, is rooted in logic or reason or facts or any truth or anything. It would be just because you have, again, it's a very idyllic kind of standard that, don't you want to believe that there's meaning? So you should believe for that reason alone, because you desire it, because you want it, because you have a psychological need or desire for it. Not based on why it's actually true. This is more like why you should believe it or why you would want to believe it. So that's only helping the point that there's an incentive behind it rather than truth behind it, or at least you're not arguing it from that angle. So again, you're saying the reason why people believe in this absolute, false absolute, fantasy, etc., is because it gives them comfort and it gives them structure and it gives them meaning, a sense of meaning. Now, again, there can be a psychological value to that, whether it's true or not, but there's also a situation where again, all you're saying is, wouldn't you rather believe in a meaningful existence than a meaningless existence? So in other words, you have an incentive there, but that's not really an argument. That's just like saying, that's just preference. You're saying, that's a more desirable thing to do, but that doesn't make it true, right? Just because you want it to be. The only question, I can't understand the word he's saying there, and I can't read the subtitles either. The only question something must answer is whether to, self-infliction, I'll call it. I'll avoid the YouTube little stigma. The point is that, or inherent S word, but as absolutists would call it in my absolutist philosophy discussion. Look, only question is whether or not you should perform self-infliction. But that's quite an extreme to jump to. Does that mean every animal should do that if they don't have any other super special sense of purpose or practice? It's mainly the contrivance state that you're recognizing that creates an imbalance that needs to be overcompensated for, and that's why you seek meaning so much. Or again, just the narcissistic, egocentric element of it, and also the simple fact that you have again, it's an extreme to jump to that. Why can't you just have like a naturalistic perspective, like simply you're alive, so make the most of it, enjoy the fruits of nature, literally even, be a hedonist, have orgies, have the maximum amount of experience. But you see a lot of this is inhibited by society. Even if you think it's overcompensated by the machination process, that's a separate debate. But you have this, again, why not just indulge in your inherent desired suggested tendencies? It's a zero-sum process, make the most of it, enjoy the fruits of nature, what you have there. Why would the default response be this self-infliction? And the reason why is because you're taking it to an extreme, like, okay, so the world is meaningless, so just enjoy it. But see, that's part of contrivance, is that you can't just do that, because then people would do it uninhibited. You'll hurt and kill and steal and do whatever you want, right, at the expense of contrivance in society, this organized structure, unnatural state. You'll do it at the expense of that, because then you'd be uninhibited. You'd say, what reason do I have to be inhibited when there is no meaning? See, it's more tied to this structure reduction incentive that we take as false absolute, false inherent state of society, contrivance, that, okay, life is meaningless, so let's make the most of it. Let's be hedonists, let's enjoy it, let's take the fruits of nature and just, the world is an oyster, ours for the taking, and let's just enjoy it and do whatever we want, orgies, etc. But no, that's not functional for a longevity process in society that isn't even self-aware. And so now we have to be reduced to a half-mast state that controls all that and inhibits all that. So now we seek some special meaning to justify that inhibition and reduction. Whereas, again, absolutists would remove the need, as I always talk about. You don't need meaning. You don't need meaning in the absence of contrivance, because now the inherent reality and tendency speaks for itself. So again, you might be as an animal in nature, but you might be self-aware and more intelligent. But again, you could just naturalistically, okay, you're alive, and so even if you can't explain everything, even if you don't find a sense of meaning in it, you're alive, so you try to live as long as possible, or you're alive, so you try to have the most experience, the most enjoyable experience, pleasurable experience, the most full experience, the most number of experiences, however you want to explain it. You can have that. So why would the assumption be, let's do self-infliction? That's such an extreme to jump to and doesn't even make any sense. What the hell does he say there? Modern man must answer. And I like this as a machination process buffer as well. Why would modern man ask that? Because now we have the freedom to think. We have free time and means to think, because we have surplus of food based on the machination process, technology available. So we've reached such a state of technology that now we can get all full on ourselves and start to, that's kind of what I'm doing right now. I'll even agree. I'm a great example of that. Like, oh, back in history when we were cavemen or whatever, we were so concerned with our mere zero-sum survival that we didn't have the time. Not that we didn't have the time. Still, cave paintings and ritualistic things. That's when early religions would have been discussed and stuff. But the point is that you have the time to think about it. So, like, oh, we have all this free time because we have a surplus, and our zero-sum means aren't at risk, so we're not as concerned with that. And we're also, have the freedom to think outside of it, and also we have the ability to, rely on surplus and machination process and stuff like that. So now we're in a position of entitlement that we've created a good, positive position where we've removed the need for a lot of inherent base tendencies, right? We've reduced it, we've allowed it to become easier to survive. So now we start to question now, what meaning or purpose is there in surviving, right? Like I say, functionalism is the stuff of animals, so if your whole life is just concerned with zero-sum means, then that's basically what you are, but that's basically how people behave anyway, in an overextended, extrapolated sense, right? Like, whatever, that's how modern people act. But, yeah, so that's... You're trying to find, like I always say, false meaning in means. Like the meaning of life is just in zero sum. So you might think I'm contradicting myself, but these are just thought processes that you could point to. Like, I'm looking at what he's saying. I'm looking at my absolutist philosophy that's not really mine, as in I believe it or practice it in my life. I'm saying I have founded some of these thoughts, and it's a very consistent way of thinking. It doesn't mean necessarily that I do that all the time, but right, if you can come up with ideas or express them without being beholden to them necessarily, right? You can discuss it, you can have the idea. So my point is that, man, this has been quite the session, actually. Holy shit. My battery's about to run out, too. So yeah, the self-infliction thing is kind of unwarranted, and also... Again, modern man is a key word because, you're so spoiled now and coddled by technology that you have the luxury and the free time to think about these things that aren't directly related to your zero-sum sustenance. So you start to question and become narcissistic and depressed, and there is a trend of that. Like, if you just keep busy, you won't be depressed because you don't have time to think about it, which is kind of a bad argument because you should be able to think as much as you want, and if your contrivance state is sound, and if your state of being everything is sound, then thinking is merely a reflection, right? It's like putting a mirror up to something or a microscope up to something. So to say, you should just have to close your eyes and not think or not look at something to be at peace with it is a fallacy, because it's a situation where you should be able to think about as much as you want and it would be fine, right? It's just a reflection of reality in terms of... So the only reason why thinking would be a bad thing is if there's something in reality that is reflecting that is bad, right? If your life is good and content and high standard, the problem with that is objectivity knows no bounds, so the standard might be unrealistically high. Like, there's always something to pick on if you think about it. So you have to be realistic too, but that also feeds into a lower standard. You might not have the highest standard possible, and you can't have it with this overextended, mass-produced suffering quality state that I love these logical razors that sort of just, I don't even need to say it. Like, what I mean, and it's well established within my discussions. So I drove like halfway here, more than halfway, and I didn't even get through the video, so I'll wait and I'll do it after this here in a second. Okay, let's try to do the rest of this while, before my battery dies or in the rest of the drive, and hopefully this part will be a little better of the drive. Okay, here we go. So, must answer why not in self-infliction, which is a very... Okay, if your birth... I'm going to go through every single claim you might... If it deserves thought, it deserves consideration fully. Long-form postulate is an accident. If your birth is an accident, your death is an accident. Now see, even the framing here is narcissistic and egotistical, the way I keep saying. That, why does it have to be an accident? Like, accident in what? Like, it's a mistake? Like, okay, when an animal is born, is that an accident, or it's just a normal, it's just a normal part of life? They're breeding because they're alive and because it feels good, and that's, nature's way of inspiring reproduction. Like, so to even say it's an accident, it's more like it's an unexplained phenomenon. It's more like it's random. Sure, you can say that, but that doesn't necessarily make it bad or meaningless, right? So again, saying it's an accident is weird framing. Like, an accident, aside from something intentional, like God intentionally designed you this way, or with all your flaws that you would then complain about or try to restrict or condemn. But the point is that, so again, whether it's an accident, you can say it's random, but random does not equal bad or meaningless, or that you can't make the most out of it. So this is a strange framing, again, that everything would have to be a very particular way to be satisfactory to you. So your life is an accident, but then you at least have control. You don't have control over the birth or the death. Well, to some extent the death, I guess, but you do have control over your life. So even if you say it's an accident or it's a random event, like animals just randomly born and they just are because they are, and you can't trace back the origin and you can't explain everything, even if you can't do that, you're here and you have control now. Once again, taking away control from people with belief systems, etc. You have control now over your life. So now your life, you can maximize what you do instead of just giving up and saying, well, I can't explain everything, I don't have all the meaning behind it. And then you do it this way because you have, it's a strange thing. What reason do you have to suck wind? But again, you're looking at it from as if you need a reason. You're alive, you were born, that's the reason. You didn't choose to be born. You can't explain exactly why or how you were born in terms of all of history, like, where did all of existence come from? Not just you, but your parents, and then where did their parents, you trace it back far enough. Where did the planet come from? Where did the universe come from? You can't explain all that. But again, why do you need a reason to suck wind? The reason is that you're alive. And again, inherent self-infliction that I talk about, it is your choice to even do that. So if you don't want to, this is absolutist, hypothetical, I'm not saying anything, but right, the point being that what reason do you have? But you're looking at it again in a weird way. Like, why do you have to so you have to justify simply like you're alive, which again, you didn't choose that, nor can you explain its origins, but you have to somehow rationalize that. Like, you're alive, that's why you're living, because you're alive and you don't want to die, or you want to experience as much as you can, live as long as possible. Animals do that to some extent, like they're trying to at least survive. So you can't just have some baseline, basic, like, self-survival instinct that you want to stay alive just for the sake of staying alive. Like, isn't that enough? So I don't really get the whole framing here. Why not just end it all? But, and again, if that's the conclusion you come to, I mean, it is what it is. But I'm not saying that, but I'm saying it's an extreme to jump to, but the real question is, why value contrivance in a heavily restrictive state? Why not say, well, there's no meaning or higher power structure, so now don't reduce yourself to it and be uninhibited. So, like, who cares about laws and government, and who cares about, social standards and morals? They're all made up constructs just to control you, which objectively they are. That doesn't mean they can't be functional to some degree, but even then they're overextended beyond their purpose of function. And so that's the real issue. You're misframing the enemy. Once again, it's not that, you need a reason to justify something. It's that you are craving this in part because of a contrivance response state that you've been reduced to, and treating that as a false absolute, and again, reinforced possibly by the belief system that we're talking about. It's interesting how ingrained that is. You're seeking meaning, but the only reason why you need meaning or desire it is for that same reason, that you have, similar to the belief system itself, all of this reductive, restrictive structure, like you can't do this, you can't do that, you're inhibited in some way, you're reduced to structure right from your inherent natural state of being. You're being intellectually dishonest by not thinking about that, again, if you don't have some grand scheme or understanding of everything, and if you don't, consider inherent self-infliction, then you're somehow being intellectually dishonest. But again, nowhere in here are you stating like actual facts or logic or reason behind a belief system. You're just simply explaining why it would be comfortable or convenient, or all the incentives behind it. Like, all of this makes you uncomfortable, so you should believe something that makes you feel comfortable, not because it's actually true or valid or logical or anything. So now that's the amazing part. Nowhere in here did he actually make an argument for why a God exists specifically, especially within his faith or a particular faith, or even in general. He doesn't even address that. He's simply saying, well, isn't it so uncomfortable and undesirable that you would be in this state, that you wouldn't have all the answers? So here's a false solution, that here are all the answers hypothetically, and then, false certainty is better than uncertainty, and it'll give you peace of mind and comfort, and it'll make you feel better about yourself. So, which I'm not even necessarily disputing, but those are not arguments for the rationale behind it. So again, you're saying, it's sort of a little bit of a straw manning in there too. Like, oh, if you don't believe in this, then you may as well just self-inflict. Like, what do you mean? Like, there's an in-between. Why can't you just live a basic zero-sum existence and enjoy it to some degree, and, indulge in all the world's pleasures and treasures, and be inhibited by society all the same, and seek overcompensations and structure from that? I'd like to see that as the baseline, though. You're not realizing the role that contrivance response plays in this, but then again, you're actively arguing for a form of contrivance response too in religion itself, would be, to placate that same role. So and the good news of Jesus Christ. Here we go. Here's the plug. At what point did you justify anything to do with Jesus Christ in particular compared to other religions, but even religions in general? The good news is all these psychological needs and discomfort you're feeling will give you this magical cure-all for them. So in other words, believe it because you want to believe it. It's desirable to believe it. It gives you peace of mind to believe it. Not because it's true, not because it's factual, not because it's accurate, but because, you have these psychological needs and uncertainties, so therefore believe whatever we tell you without question. Jesus Christ, there's eternal life, so you got to reduce yourself to a half-mass state where you can't fully live this life, where you're constantly inhibited, like contrivance, society, etc. You're constantly inhibited, so you reduce this life in half-mass, zero-sum. You reduce this life to a lesser state, a less full existence, for the promises of, an eternal life or heaven. So you see that's just a means to control people, to make them comfortable or content with that state of being, of living in a lesser state than their full and uninhibited existence. And once again, just the desire, like, don't you want to go to heaven? So why wouldn't you believe? But sure, I would want a lot of things, but just because you want something doesn't make it true. Like, I don't know how much I can explain that. A lot of this whole thing is just, don't you wish this was the case? So you should believe it's the case because you wish it's the case, right? Don't you want some perfect absolute meaning? Don't you want some structure? Don't you want some answers to all the questions in the universe? We're not actually going to provide those, but you can just believe in them anyway and just don't think about it, as if that's not intellectually dishonest as well. And very carefully use the talents that God has blessed you with to look at the ego in that, though. Why couldn't you just use what you have to try to survive without God being involved? Trying to give it a sense of purpose, like, it's not an accident. right? Like, as if that framing even makes sense, that it wouldn't need to be an accident. It could just be an event that happened. We assign, even me saying it's random, we're trying to assign a rhyme and reason to it, but that's a human way of thinking. That's even, like I say, the need to be created is a human idea. Make the world more like heaven, then we could remove the need for heaven, right? That's the first absolutist correct thing he said here, is that make the world more like heaven, then we don't have to worry about heaven as much. Right? Then we don't have to reduce our life to a half-mast state, and we already have heaven right here. But that's kind of an odd thing to even say. But again, peasants working for promises of heaven, living in a lesser state that they otherwise wouldn't tolerate because of that, for promises of something unconfirmed that they can't verify. I mean, it's a great way to psychologically control people. I have to give it up, but it's not too prudent, really. All it shows is a psychological need that you have, right? It's comforting, it's desirable, it gives you false certainty, it gives you peace of mind, it gives you, peace with death in terms of... So you realize in that there's that subliminal manifestation of each of these things, like... It's a reflection of a lot of desires that people have, or insecurities that people have, fears that people have, everything like that. And we call that, there's a line like that from the Seventh Seal, actually. We make an idol of our fear, and that idol we call God, right? We're afraid of death, so there's heaven. We're afraid of getting killed, so everyone who hurts us would go to hell. We're afraid of, whatever we need psychologically, it'll give us, whether it's true or accurate or real or whatever. And then let me watch it again. Meaningless. Again, accident is sort of preconceived framing. So your birth is not an accident, your death is not an accident. And we're going to wave the little carrot on a stick of eternal life to try to control you in this life and minimize and reduce you to a half-mast state where you're not fully alive and fully maximizing your potential and experience in this existence. We're going to use the promise of some greater existence to reduce this one. Imagine that. Imagine the greatest point that I could possibly make, but you just don't get it. Which is that I'm acting like I'm talking to the guy, but you know what I mean. Like, you're using the promise of this, right, eternal life, heaven, etc., to control and reduce and restrict people here, right, and not let them live their full uninhibited experience and existence. And so you reduce it to a controlled state, and the controlled state is very undesirable, or whatever, not inherent desire suggested. And so that turned into a whole fucking hour-long discussion, but a lot of my good logical razors in there. I feel so weird in doing this, but whatever. That was a horrible kind of... It's just a short video, so I don't want to judge it too harshly. Like, he might make other better points elsewhere, but it's so wrong-headed because you're arguing from, a point of desire, right? Everything he's saying, let me count the desirable moments. Like, it's meaningless to live without God, so you should pretend God exists because that gives you an illusion of meaning. Why not self-inflict? You're saying accident, human-centric. That's a very negative perspective. Here is a promise of eternal life. Don't you want to believe in all these things? That's basically what he's saying. Your desire. He's exploiting your desire. Don't you want to believe in the Tooth Fairy and Santa Claus? Don't you want to believe that everything's perfect the way you want it to be? Don't you want to believe in eternal life? Don't you want to believe in heaven? Don't you want to believe that all these standards we have are absolute? Don't you want to believe? So none of that's an argument for why it's actually true or the case. It's just trying to exploit your desires and your peace of mind, insecurities and stuff. And the way that you can exploit that is basically by, again, that's all he's saying in here. Like, none of these are actual arguments. They're only just, your life would be meaningless, and you would feel this need to even do the thing I was talking about, the S word. So now, because you'd feel meaningless, you're not providing actual meaning. You're saying you should believe in something that would give you that impression of meaning. So you're just trying to take advantage of somebody then. Like, look how meaningless your life feels. So now we're going to try to find refuge in something, try to find comfort in something. That doesn't make that something valid or accurate or real or true or absolute. It just makes it, again, like a necessary delusion or outlet or closure or peace of mind, right, that you could have. Again, I'm not even denying, okay, even if you believe it is valid, that's not a very good argument for why it's valid, right? To say, don't you have this need for peace of mind and comfort and certainty and everything? Oh, yes, indeed, human beings do have that need and desire. So, okay, cool, but now where's the answer? Give us the answer. Give us, why is it the case? And again, I could even use it in the particular faith argument, like, why specifically is Christianity, Jesus Christ, that answer, as opposed to other religions or other belief systems or, again, other perspectives, measure, worldview. But even outside of that, why... you would have to qualify that particular specific belief and also just this time, like, I don't know, that was much more exhausting than it had any business being, and so that's fine. Okay, so here I'm going to be quickly debunking a fallacious claim by Charlie Kirk, and it's disturbing to see how many people actually cheer this on and parrot it mindlessly, but they don't seem to understand. I've had this discussion before with somebody else. The words objective or the word inherent or the word absolute, right? When it comes to morality and similar things. Let's see what he says again. They're dunking all over this kid and acting like it's a big thing, but let's just see what they say. I'll put the subtitles on.
I believe in objective morality, so that can apply to...
Okay, objective morality. Let's just see what he says, but...
It's not objectively wrong to leave a full-born baby by the fire and just...
And this is like almost a poor attempt at a gotcha question that the conservative side would almost condemn in like the mainstream media. They're trying to, like, he'll ask that always with the Holocaust. Was the Holocaust objectively wrong? Well, considering that you're a subjective human being, you can say it's subjectively wrong in your opinion, and then 99.999% of people can agree with you on a subjective level. And then collectively, the real question should be, how can we best go about preventing something like that from happening on the subjective level using our subjective means and resources? But on a more micro level, it makes more sense if you just look at it in a simple way instead of this failed attempt at a gotcha, like, oh, look, he can't say the Holocaust is bad, let's dunk on him. You're not really making any point at all, right? Because the conclusion would even be, regardless of, label, atheist, whatever you want to say, the conclusion would be you realize morality isn't objective or inherent or absolute, because then it would resolve itself outside of the subjective human realm, and your opinion on it and your whole back and forth and, aggrandizing and all of this would be unnecessary. This is a form of social contrivance on a subjective level right here. The fact that you're stigmatizing and trying to reinforce, you don't realize that what is even happening right here is subjective. Right? Everything you're saying and doing, this is all subjective. There's nothing wrong with that, but that creates a different standard. That's why you have subjective police officers, right, to enforce and uphold the law, which sometimes they make mistakes on the subjective level, right? So all of that shows you it's not objective. You have to create a law enforcement system, a court system, laws. You have to subjectively come up with all of this, right, made by flawed, imperfect, subjective people. Then the subjective cop has to go after the subjective culprit. Then you have to go to a subjective court with a subjective lawyer, a subjective judge. That's all fine, and that's the purpose of society to a degree. Like, So the real discussion would be, how can we best achieve that functional state? How can we prevent people from doing these things that are subjectively wrong in the view of the vast majority of people? 99.9% of people agree. Then we come to a consensus, then we make laws. Like, so on a practical, observable, everyday basis, you're seeing how it's subjective. You're seeing how, a subjective police officer, they might make a mistake. Maybe the killer will get away. So how is that objective? They subjectively messed up. They let him get away. Or we subjectively, you have corrupt cops. You have subjectively, you have a court system that might let the culprit get away. They're not guilty. But that's all subjective, and it comes down to the human level. Here's an example of an objective claim, since nobody seems to understand what the word objective means. It doesn't mean that, you so badly want it to be true that it just becomes true, or that 99.9% of people agree with it, or that society can functionally try to uphold it, or that that's what should be believed. That it's not a should be. Objective would be inherent. Like, okay, the need to breathe oxygen is objective. So regardless of your view or debate, there would be no debate on the subject. You could say subjectively, okay, you don't need to breathe oxygen, that's your opinion. But then if you put it to the test, you would die. So that would be self-evident, right? So you wouldn't need to prove it or debate it or make any big deal about it. It's just evident, self-evident, and you can see it to be true. Right. So when you say objective, inherent, or absolute, all terms that I've heard people like this use in this kind of context, it would mean that God, if you believe in God, for example, a God would strike you down with a bolt of lightning and prevent you from doing it, something like that, or wouldn't have made you with the ability to do it in the first place. That would be objective because it would be something outside of human control. It wouldn't rely on human subjective reinforcement and enforcement in the first place, right? And social stigma and indoctrination, it wouldn't rely on that. So the fact that it does rely on that means that it's worth upholding, but that's sort of an expression that I have. Like, the best way to achieve something is to realize it's not true. Or sometimes the worst way to achieve something is to pretend, just because you want it to be true so badly, you pretend it already is true, and then you won't actually do what is best or necessary to uphold it. So you pretend like, okay, killing a person is wrong, and 99.9% of people agree with that, obviously, and then society agrees and we enforce it and uphold the law. So on a practical, observable, everyday basis, you can see how it's subjective and it requires that subjective enforcement. So the real discussion would be, how can we best achieve that, right? How can we make laws better? How can we, whatever we need to do to make that achieved at the best level, which we do on a practical basis every day. And the two layers, one is indoctrination and one is enforcement that I've always discussed, both layers to try to prevent, undesirable behaviors. But yeah, if it was objective or absolute, God would strike you down with a bolt of lightning. So that would be outside of human control, or the laws of nature themselves would prevent you from doing it or address it, directly. So it wouldn't be that it would come down to some subjective human level. So that's where people just don't seem to understand what the word objective actually means, because your objective standard then is so strong that it happens anyway, right? He'll evoke the Holocaust. You could use like the Uyghur Muslims now, what's happening in China. So something is so objective that it comes down to, well, it can happen anyway. And what stopped it from happening? Subjective human beings coming in with their own resources and military and fighting it out and then ending it. So that's good that it ended, obviously, but the point being that you needed humans to subjectively, on their imperfect, flawed level, to address it themselves, either prevent it from happening or they're the ones who made it happen. So the fact that people are able to have that impact, right, it works better on a micro level, like killing a person is objectively wrong, you would say here. But then people can still do it, and people do it all the time. So all it takes to defy a supposed objective reality of the universe, right, an objective truth, is a person just feels like, you know what, I feel like doing something different. So they're having a bad day, they're mad, they're crazy, whatever. They go out, they kill somebody. So now your objective reality, your objective truth, it goes out the window. So your objective is so weak and trivial that it requires constant subjective reinforcement, indoctrination, constant upholding on a subjective level by subjective people, police, courts. Again, not diminishing it. That's just the reality of what we have to do, because it's not objective. We have to stay vigilant and actively uphold it, which is the whole purpose. This is like pretty elementary school understanding of how the world works. Like, rather than you just want something to be true, so you just believe it to be true. But if that was the case, okay, it's subjective, so then there's no need to debate it. You're right, Charlie Kirk, so let's just suspend laws and courts and police tomorrow and it's so objective that like the need to breathe oxygen, it would just happen on its own. So you wouldn't need to uphold it on a subjective societal level, right? Why would we need to even have this debate? Why would we need to have, subjective, flawed, imperfect people upholding it as society has to do, right? Just because people agree on it doesn't matter, right? You don't need that, because why should you need subjective enforcement of an objective standard? So you're not really understanding what it means. It's a poor attempt to kind of dunk on somebody. It's a poor attempt to do sort of a gotcha question. But again, if you were to say objective, even the title is a little deceptive. Like, you're not saying it's on a subjective level. Of course, you'd say it's wrong. And I don't know who this guy is. I don't really care, the kid, but you would say subjectively it's wrong because you're a subjective human being, just like he's a subjective human being. So you're kind of being a little full of yourself to think you can make an objective claim. But just to put it this way, your objective claim, or it wouldn't even be a claim then, it would be an objective observation of just objective reality, would be so weak that anybody could just defy it like that. So that's the real point too. Like, why would an event like that be able to happen then? Oh, it was objectively wrong. That's why it happened. That's why people were still able to do it. Why subjectively flawed, terrible, evil people, etc., right, between the H man, I won't even say his name, and the N group, right, of people, I won't even use these words, but like, they were able to, in their vile, subjective, terrible, corrupted, minds, their subjective will was able to do this horrible event. And it took the subjective will of others to either enable it, right, not prevent it from happening, allowing it to happen, etc., being afraid, etc., whatever the reasoning, but it took their subjective will to do it. It took other subjective, not stopping it. And then eventually it took other subjective humans to stop it. So I just think it's a semantics argument, and it's pretty weak, because the end result is, right, despite all the attempt at this pseudo nonsense, these comments are kind of irritating. Like, you're not getting, it's just a semantics nonsense, attempt at debate. The end conclusion in both cases is Charlie Kirk goes home at the end of the day and realizes that this objective morality requires subjective human reinforcement and upholding by police, by courts, etc. Right? So these are upheld by subjective human beings every day. He would go home knowing that that's the case. The other person would also do the same thing. I got to go home and I know that, I'm safe because I'm protected by subjective human law enforcement, etc. So both people, on a practical, observable, everyday basis, that's what's happening. And so we could debate how to best achieve that state, since that's the state that we live in, instead of, oh my goodness, it's subjective. But what does that do? What does it matter that it's subjective then? Because it still requires and comes down to subjective human enforcement and upholding on an active level, including what you're even doing here. It's such a weak. Let's just watch.
Say you're on your own. Have a nice life.
Well, yeah, I'm calling into question objective morality, so I obviously have to...
No, I know. I'm just trying to make you hear back how insane what you are saying.
It's insane to say that.
No.
The objectivity of it.
No, I know. So,
Obviously, I think it's wrong.
Let's get more graphic. So,
He even says it right there. Obviously, I think it's wrong on my subjective personal level. This is where society creates like the false inherent contrivance response state too that I talk about. Is if enough people believe something, that doesn't make it true. Like 99.9999% could agree, and then that gives society a backbone and a basis to say, this is why we have laws, and that's why we prevent it and enforce it. Rather than make it a simple this is like one of those weak, he's not a stupid person, and I respect him to some extent, but this is the worst framing possible. Like, you're trying to turn what could be a functional argument, like how can we best enforce and uphold our subjective morality using laws and courts and police and social stigma, indoctrination, parenting. How can we best achieve this on a functional level that we prevent people from doing things that are bad? And even as a society, governments and stuff, how can we prevent bad things from happening? Should we have more police? Should we have a better law system? Should we, we could discuss it on a functional level. But instead, you're trying to do this weird thing where you're saying, well, I'm just gonna, get people to, boo you and get emotional and act like, oh, if you don't say what we want to be true, to be objective, then that's somehow your fault, and we'll get subjectively upset about it.
Okay. You put 1,000 Jews in a gas chamber, and the Nazis thought what they were doing was good, and they...
See, you just said it right there. They thought what they was doing was good, and they were able to do it. So, in other words, it's objectively wrong, but all it would take for it to happen again, or happen in the first place, would be subjective people can just think whatever they want, think that it's good, or that it's okay, and then they subjectively just do it. So what would it take? Would it take this insistence upon, well, it's subjectively wrong? So I guess the problem is it creates almost like this passive approach. Like, well, it's subjective, so we don't have to worry about it. It's subjective. It just goes without saying, so we can just sit on our hands and it'll resolve itself, right? The laws of nature will stop it, or God will stop it. But it takes human effort and practice to stop it. So if you really looked at it, he would say, I'm going to stop it myself, or, government, we have to actively try to stop it and prevent it from happening. So all it would take is them just believing that they're right and they're good subjectively, and then they could do it, even though it's subjectively wrong. So you'll say that they're objectively wrong, but that doesn't stop the reality of it happening. What would stop the reality would be a functional subjective action.
Press the button. Were they right or were they wrong in gassing millions of Jews?
Objectively,
like, when you say, is it objectively wrong?
I would just say I'm a subjective human being, so I would say, in my opinion, it's wrong, but it's a meaningless question. The distinction is pointless. Like, what does it matter? Okay, it is objectively wrong, but we still have to subjectively prevent it, or it's subjectively wrong and we have to subjectively prevent it. It's the same conclusion.
If you say it's objectively wrong, you're implying that you can derive a truth value from it, and I don't think you can. So I don't think that you can make a true statement regarding whether
if it was
something's good or bad.
Got it.
If it was objectively wrong, it wouldn't be possible for it to happen. I don't think you know what that means. Like, okay, something is objectively wrong according to the laws of nature, so you can't do it. Nature prevents it from happening because it's wrong according to an objective standard, the laws of nature or the laws of God, so they wouldn't have allowed you to do it in the first place, or they would, again, address it inherently, strike you down with the bolt of lightning, etc. Or, again, the words absolute, inherent, or objective are all usable.
So just to be clear, the Nazis could have been right in their actions, in your view.
In your view, but that makes no sense because it's not your. And again, I don't know exactly what this guy's deal is, but could have been right in your view. Well, what you're really saying is you just said it yourself. You just said earlier it was right in their view. They thought what they were doing was good. So it's possible for their actions to be right in their view. That's how they were able to rationalize doing it to themselves. Right, like why they were able to do it. So yes, it's possible for them to subjectively believe what they're doing is okay. That's why they were able to do it. And it's also possible for them to subjectively enact such a horrible thing. So even your view here is kind of a cheap shot because you're asking objective and then saying your view. It's possible in a subjective human view for anything to be the case, but that's the whole point of a collective enforcing its will. So 99.9% of people would agree subjectively that it's wrong and it shouldn't have happened and could have tried to prevent it, etc. So saying, oh, it could have been right in your view, but you're seeing that it was right according to their view, their subjective view, believed that it was right, unfortunately, and that's why it was able to happen.
Implies that right is an actual thing. I don't believe you can determine a truth value from a moral claim.
So the Nazis were not objectively evil.
Yeah.
Again, the word evil is even still subjective. Like, you're not understanding what you're really saying, but I get
I
it.
said that like 4 times. Like, yeah, you can't derive objective moral statements from like things. I'm not saying they're not wrong. Like, they are wrong. Oh.
Well, no, it's okay.
Yeah.
No, I just want to make sure this is important.
And he's making like, in his opinion, like, oh my God, in his opinion, I'm not saying they're not wrong. I mean, that's obvious. It goes without saying. I would lead with that. They're wrong. It's terrible. It shouldn't have happened. That's my subjective view. And that's the subjective view of the majority of people. And that subjective view would be what it takes to stop it from happening again.
Because what you are saying, and you're saying it very clearly, is that we look at the Holocaust and it's just a matter of opinion.
It's a matter of opinion in the sense that, see, why would that be a threat to you? That's like social Darwinism, though. Yeah, 99.9% of people would agree, right, that it's bad. So, and we should try to prevent something similar from happening. And even at the time, people might have felt the same way, but it didn't stop it from happening. So that's the bigger concern. How do we stop it?
That's kind of the problem of being an atheist. You have to bite the bullet.
There's not really a problem with it. Even I would disagree with him there, but I don't get it. Like, it's really stupid. Let's address some of these comments. We cannot scientifically prove objective morality. Most humans have good morals. Like, it's just a stupid point. Some of these people are defending it. Future of America. Like, you're not understanding the point. But no, I would just lead with that. In my subjective opinion, as a subjective human being, it's wrong, obviously. Like, why wouldn't you say that? And then clear, consistent, and polite. Feels bad, see people get murdered, can't understand. Yes, in my subjective, I guess people really don't know what the word objective means. They just don't get it. It's written in laws by subjective human beings. That's why it's subjective. Like, we have to have a subjective human being write this down in a law and enforce it. But that means it's subjective. So at the very least, like, whatever you think objective means is not very strong. So, okay, it's subjective. I agree. I concede the point. And in order to uphold that objective truth and reality of the universe, we have to be vigilant. We have to actively uphold it every single day. Again, social stigma, indoctrination, enforcement, police, courts. We need all that. And again, consisting of subjective, imperfect, flawed people, etc. We need all that, actively upholding it, because that's how objectivity works, right? That it requires a constant subjective human buffer to be the case. If there's no God, you can't say it's objective. It wouldn't even have to do with God, though. It could just be the laws of nature. Like, oh, it's objectively wrong for something, that can't happen in nature. Title is misleading. It's wrong because of his moral view, not object. Yeah, exactly. Not objectively wrong. Since at least some people have an actual brain here. Not objectively wrong, and it's just a gotcha thing. Their opinions. Stealing property is considered wrong, but not objectively. But it makes it seem like, oh no, that means you're somehow defending it. Like, are you really this stupid? Yeah, the culture stuff. No one to run a mess. I mean, it ends up being the same point, but